Click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this. It all started innocently enough. Mark was just my daughter, Emma's boyfriend. A nice, polite young man who was always respectful when he came by the house. I'd seen them together for a while, but he had never been anything more to me than just Emma's boyfriend. I'd liked him well enough. Thought he was a good influence on her, but I never thought twice about him beyond that. He was part of her world, not mine. But then, one weekend, Emma went out of town for a few days with some friends, leaving Mark behind. I knew he would be around. He practically lived at our house half the time anyway, and I didn't mind. In a way, I was glad he had become so comfortable with us. It meant Emma was in good hands, that he cared about her. So when he offered to help me with some chores around the house, I didn't think much of it. In fact, I appreciated the company. We started in the garden, pulling weeds, clearing out leaves, simple things, but it felt nice to have someone helping. We chatted casually, mostly about Emma and his plans for the future. Mark was easy to talk to, and I found myself enjoying our conversation more than I expected. He had this calm, grounded way about him, and it made me feel at ease. Before I knew it, we had spent hours outside together, laughing and talking as if we were old friends. Afterward, I invited him inside for some lemonade. We sat down in the kitchen, still chatting, and it felt natural. But as we talked, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way he looked at me, the way he laughed at my jokes, the way he'd listen with such focus. It was subtle, but it was there, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. I brushed it off as nothing, just a harmless afternoon, but later that evening I found myself thinking about our time together, and I realized I'd felt different. There was something about Mark that lingered in my mind, and it made me feel both excited and unsettled. He was my daughter's boyfriend, and I knew I had no business thinking about him this way, yet I couldn't shake it. I kept replaying the day in my head, wondering if he'd felt it too, or if I was just reading too much into things. The next day, he came over again, this time to help fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen. Emma had told him about it before she left, and he'd offered to take a look. I tried to keep things casual, to act like everything was normal, but the tension was there, hovering in the air between us, and I could feel it with every glance, every quiet moment. I wasn't sure if he noticed, but I couldn't help myself. The closer he came, the more aware I was of him, his presence, his warmth, the way he moved around me. He finished fixing the faucet, and as he stood up, our eyes met for a moment too long. I felt my heart race, felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in years, and I knew this was dangerous. This was my daughter's boyfriend, and whatever I was feeling, it needed to stop. But standing there, looking into his eyes, I couldn't bring myself to step back. After that moment in the kitchen, I tried to avoid him, or at least to keep my distance. I thought it would help, that if I just focused on other things, this feeling would fade. But Mark kept finding reasons to come around. He'd drop by to check on something for Emma, or bring over some groceries she'd asked for. And every time he came over, I felt that same rush of emotions building up inside me. One evening, a few days later, Mark stopped by unannounced. I was surprised to see him at the door, but I let him in, hoping he'd just be there for a few minutes. He mentioned he had just been out running an errand and thought he'd check in, since Emma was still out of town. I could tell he felt a bit awkward, but he was trying to be polite, to keep things light. We ended up sitting in the living room, chatting. I was doing my best to act normal, to keep the conversation friendly and casual. But there was something different about him that night. He seemed more at ease, almost as if he sensed there was something unspoken between us two. And the longer we talked, the harder it was to ignore. At one point, he leaned back, stretching his arms out along the back of the couch, and I couldn't help but notice how close he was. I felt my heart beating faster, felt the tension that had been building up inside me spill over. It was as if everything around us faded, leaving just the two of us in that small space, caught up in this silent understanding of what we both felt but couldn't say. Mark shifted closer, just a small movement, but it felt like a step across a line. I could feel his presence so close to mine, his arm resting just inches away, and I felt a pull, a magnetic force that was impossible to ignore. I should have said something, should have put an end to it right then, but the words wouldn't come. I was too caught up in the moment, in the electricity that seemed to flow between us. He turned to look at me, his gaze intense and searching, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, that he might break the silence and acknowledge what was happening, but he didn't. Instead, he just watched me, waiting, as if he was looking for permission. I could feel my resolve slipping, my thoughts blurring, and all I could focus on was him, his eyes, his closeness, the warmth that radiated from him. But then, as if some invisible force pulled me back, I realized how wrong this was. This was my daughter's boyfriend, and no matter how strong the pull between us felt, I knew I couldn't do this. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to break the gaze, to look away, and remind myself of the boundaries we were so dangerously close to crossing. The moment passed, but the tension still lingered, heavy and unspoken. I knew he felt it too, that he was as caught up in it as I was, but we both knew it couldn't go any further. I managed a weak smile, excusing myself to get some water, hoping the distance would help clear my head. When I returned, he was sitting up, looking as if he too had been snapped back to reality. I sat down again, this time putting a little more space between us, hoping he'd understand that whatever this was, it couldn't continue. We shared a quiet look, a silent agreement, and I knew he understood. He stayed for a few more minutes, our conversation light but tinged with the knowledge of what had almost happened, and then he left, leaving me alone with the echo of everything that could have been. After that night, things felt different. Mark stopped coming around as often, and when he did, there was a polite distance between us, a shared understanding that we had almost crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I felt a mix of relief and something that felt uncomfortably like regret, knowing we had both pulled back, but also wondering what would have happened if we hadn't. Emma returned from her trip a few days later, and things settled back into a familiar rhythm. Seeing her with Mark was strange at first. They looked so happy together, and watching them laugh and talk, I reminded myself that he belonged with her. I kept telling myself it was a harmless infatuation, a fleeting moment, and I needed to let it go. But letting go wasn't as easy as I'd hoped. I'd catch myself thinking about that night, about how close we had come, and every time I saw him, a spark of that tension would flare up again, reminding me of everything we had almost shared. I knew it was wrong, knew it was dangerous, but those feelings lingered in the back of my mind, a constant, silent temptation. One evening, Emma had invited some friends over, and the house was lively with laughter and conversation. I stayed in the kitchen, keeping myself busy to avoid spending too much time around Mark. But as the evening wore on, I found myself alone for a moment, and before I knew it, he had walked in, grabbing a glass of water and giving me a small, knowing smile. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to stir up everything I'd been trying to bury. I felt the weight of all those unspoken words, all the lingering glances, and I knew he felt it too. We stood there, side by side, neither of us saying a word, but the silence spoke volumes. The pull was still there, undeniable and intense, but we both knew better. We both knew it was something we couldn't act on. Just then, Emma came in, breaking the tension and pulling us both back to reality. She laughed, oblivious, and wrapped her arms around Mark, drawing him into a playful embrace. I watched them together, feeling a pang of guilt and relief, grateful for the reminder of why I needed to keep my distance. As the night wore on, I felt a sense of closure. Mark and I had come close to something neither of us could explain, but it was something that would remain unfulfilled, a secret memory that we'd both carry but never speak of. I'd let it stay as a fleeting moment, something to leave in the past. In the days and weeks that followed, things gradually returned to normal. The distance between Mark and me grew, and I watched him and Emma, happy and carefree, reminding myself that I had made the right choice. It was a chapter that had almost been written, a story that had almost unfolded, but in the end, it remained just that, an almost, and somehow that was enough. The house was alive with the sound of chatter, music, and clinking glasses. Everyone seemed eager to leave the past year behind and welcome the new one with open arms. I was busy in the kitchen, pouring drinks and arranging snacks on a tray, when Ethan walked in. My son-in-law always had this effortless charm about him, the kind that made him instantly likable. But tonight, there was something different in the way he carried himself, subdued, almost reflective. "You've been hiding in here all night," he said, leaning casually against the counter. His smile was warm, but his eyes held a tiredness that tugged at me. "Someone's got to keep the food coming," I replied, attempting a light tone. "What's your excuse for slipping away from the party?" Ethan shrugged, running a hand through his hair. "Needed a breather, I guess. It's been a long year." I nodded, understanding without needing details. My daughter and Ethan had been navigating a rocky patch in their marriage, though they both tried to keep things civil, especially around family. Still, there was no mistaking the tension that had settled between them over the past few months. For a moment we stood in comfortable silence, the hum of the party muffled by the kitchen walls. Then Ethan reached for a glass, filling it with soda. "You've always been good at this, you know, holding everything together." I raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot of credit for someone who just arranged a cheese plate." He chuckled softly, and the sound made the room feel smaller, more intimate. "I mean it," he said, his voice quieter now. "You've always been the one who makes things feel steady, safe." The sincerity in his words caught me off guard, and I found myself searching his face, unsure of how to respond. Ethan had always been kind, respectful, but this felt different, more personal. I shook off the thought as quickly as it came. "You're too sweet," I said, brushing past him to take the tray to the living room. As I passed, I felt the faintest brush of his hand against my arm, and though it could have been accidental, it sent a shiver down my spine. Back in the living room, the countdown was still an hour away, and everyone was in high spirits. But I found it hard to focus, my mind replaying that brief exchange in the kitchen. It was nothing, I told myself, just a harmless moment. But the way his words had lingered, and the way I had felt them, left me unsettled. The night went on, but I was acutely aware of Ethan's presence, how he seemed to find reasons to be near me without drawing attention. A shared joke here, a passing glance there. Each interaction felt charged in a way I couldn't explain, and yet I couldn't bring myself to step away from it. When the clock struck 11, the house was buzzing with excitement, but I found myself retreating to the den for a moment of quiet. I wasn't expecting Ethan to follow, but when he appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, my breath caught in my throat. Here's the continuation with a longer second part. I wasn't sure what to say when Ethan stepped into the den, closing the door softly behind him. The muffled sounds of the party outside felt distant, as if we'd slipped into a world apart. He didn't speak right away, and I could feel the weight of his gaze as I pretended to straighten the already tidy stack of magazines on the coffee table. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "You're not," I replied, glancing at him over my shoulder. "Just needed a little break from the noise." "Same," he said, crossing the room to sit on the edge of the couch. His presence felt too close, though he was still a respectable distance away. "I think everyone's pretending tonight, smiling, laughing, acting like it's all fine." I hesitated before sitting down in the armchair across from him. Isn't that what New Year's is about? Pretending the slate's clean, even when it's not? He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe it's about realizing how much you wish you could start over." The vulnerability in his tone startled me. Ethan had always been so composed, even during the worst of times with my daughter. I suddenly felt an urge to comfort him, to tell him it would all be okay, even though I wasn't sure it would. "Ethan," I began, but he cut me off. "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand through his hair again, a nervous habit I'd noticed earlier. "I don't mean to dump this on you, it's just, you're easy to talk to." "It's okay," I said softly. "I'm here if you need to get something off your chest." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine in a way that made my stomach flutter. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Of course," I said, though my voice was quieter now. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the air between us thick with something unspoken. I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks and quickly looked away, breaking the spell. "I should probably get back to the party," I said, standing too abruptly. But as I turned toward the door, Ethan rose too, closing the gap between us in a few steps. "Wait," he said, his voice low but firm. He hesitated, and for a second, I thought he might say something that would cross a line we could never uncross. Instead, he reached out and touched my hand, his fingers warm against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt charged, like an unspoken question hanging in the air. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't move my hand, but I didn't pull it away either. He began, then let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Never mind, it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it in the way he lingered, his thumb brushing against my knuckles before he finally let go. When I walked out of the den, my heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. I avoided him for the rest of the night, throwing myself into hosting duties to keep my mind from wandering. But I was acutely aware of him, of the way his eyes seemed to follow me from across the room, of the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. As midnight approached, everyone gathered in the living room for the countdown. My daughter was next to Ethan, her arm looped casually through his, and I felt a pang of guilt that caught me off guard. What was wrong with me? He was her husband, and I had no right to feel this way. Still, when the clock struck 12 and the room erupted in cheers and embraces, I couldn't help but glance his way. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that instant, it felt like the rest of the world had fallen away. The house had quieted down. Guests had left, laughter and cheers fading into the cold New Year's night. My daughter had gone to bed hours earlier, tired from the festivities and the champagne. I stayed behind to clean up, needing something, anything, to distract myself from the thoughts swirling in my head. I didn't hear Ethan come into the kitchen until he spoke. "Need some help?" I turned, startled, and found him standing in the doorway. His tie was loosened, and the top button of his shirt was undone, revealing just a hint of the skin beneath. His hair was slightly mussed, like he'd been running his fingers through it again. "It's late," I said, forcing a smile. "You should get some rest." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, stepping closer. "Too much on my mind." I didn't know what to say to that. The air felt heavy between us, the same unspoken tension from earlier, now suffocating in its intensity. I busied myself with wiping the counter, avoiding his gaze. "Thank you," he said suddenly. I frowned, glancing up at him. For what? For always being there, for listening, for making things feel right, even when they're not. His words hung in the air, and I froze, unsure of how to respond. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and I felt my pulse quicken. "Ethan," I began, but my voice faltered when he reached out, gently taking the dishcloth from my hands and setting it aside. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I needed you to know how much you mean to me." His words were like a knife cutting through the fragile barrier I'd been trying so hard to maintain. I should have stopped him, should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot. As he stepped even closer, his hand brushing against my arm. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I drew in a shaky breath. "This isn't right," I managed, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he said, his eyes searching mine, "but it doesn't stop it from feeling real." The space between us was gone now, his hand lingering on my arm as his gaze dropped to my lips. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world outside didn't exist, and it was just the two of us, teetering on the edge of something we both knew we shouldn't want. But then, just as his face inched closer, I found the strength to step back, breaking the spell. "Ethan," I said firmly, though my voice trembled, "this can't happen." The look in his eyes was one of pain, but also understanding. He nodded slowly, his hand falling back to his side. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't mean to." "I know," I interrupted, swallowing hard, "but we can't. It would destroy everything." He nodded again, stepping back further, giving me the space I so desperately needed. Without another word, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving me alone with the echoes of what had almost happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, my mind racing. What had I been thinking? How had I let it get this far? The weight of what could have been hung heavy in the air, but as I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs, I knew one thing for certain. It would never happen again. Click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this. I wasn't expecting Mike to come over that evening. He and my husband Dan had been friends for years, college buddies who stayed close even after life took them in different directions. Mike would visit every now and then, usually for dinner or to catch a game with Dan. I always liked him. He was funny and easy to talk to, but I'd never thought of him as anything more than my husband's friend, until that night. It was a Friday, and Dan had called me from work to say he'd be late. I'd been looking forward to a quiet night by myself, maybe watching a movie or finally getting around to that book I'd started months ago. But when the doorbell rang, I found Mike standing there, smiling like he always did, holding a six-pack in one hand. "Dan's not home yet," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Yeah, I know," he said, shrugging. "He told me to come by anyway. Thought I'd keep you company until he gets here." I didn't mind. Mike was always good company, and besides, it wasn't like we hadn't hung out before. I offered him something to drink, and we ended up in the kitchen, chatting while I finished preparing dinner. It was casual at first, just the usual small talk. He told me about his day, and I asked him about his latest work projects. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. I'm not sure when it happened, but at some point, the conversation became less about what we were saying and more about how we were saying it. I caught myself laughing a little too hard at one of his jokes, and when our eyes met, I felt a flutter in my stomach that I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing. We were just friends, and I was being silly. But the way Mike was looking at me, it wasn't the way a man looks at his best friend's wife. Or maybe it was, and I'd just never noticed before. Either way, it made me nervous. I could feel the tension building between us, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. He leaned against the counter, his eyes lingering on me just a little too long. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "I don't think I've ever really told you how much I appreciate you, Karen. You're always so kind, so easy to talk to." I felt my cheeks flush, and I looked away, busying myself with the food on the stove. "Well, I try," I said, my voice coming out a little more flustered than I intended. "Dan's lucky to have you as a friend." There was a pause, a long one, where I could feel his eyes on me, and for the first time I didn't know what to do with myself. I was suddenly aware of how close he was standing, of the space between us shrinking with every second that passed. My heart was pounding, and I hated that it was. This was Mike, for God's sake. He was practically family, but there was no denying the way he was looking at me, and even worse, there was no denying the way it made me feel. It had been so long since I'd felt that kind of attention from anyone, and it stirred something in me I thought had been long buried. "Karen," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between us was heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite explain. His eyes searched mine, and I knew, deep down, that this was a line we were standing dangerously close to crossing. But before either of us could say anything else, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Dan had finally come home. The sound of Dan's footsteps coming down the hallway was like a splash of cold water. I blinked, turning quickly back to the stove, trying to pretend that nothing had happened, that there hadn't been a shift between Mike and me in those quiet seconds before Dan arrived. "Hey, babe," Dan called out, strolling into the kitchen with his usual relaxed energy. "Mike, you're here early." I forced a smile, grateful that Dan was oblivious to the tension hanging in the room. "Dinner's almost ready," I said, hoping my voice sounded steady. I glanced at Mike, who had already moved away from the counter, his easy smile back in place like nothing had happened. But when our eyes met again, there was a flicker of something beneath the surface, something neither of us could pretend hadn't just happened. Dan and Mike fell into their usual banter, talking about work and sports, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I played my part, serving dinner and laughing at their jokes, but the entire time I couldn't shake the feeling of Mike's gaze lingering on me when Dan wasn't looking, and I hated how aware of it I was, how much it affected me. As we sat down to eat, I did everything I could to focus on Dan. He was his usual charming self, and I could see how much he enjoyed having his friend over. I loved him, of course I did, but there was something about the way Mike had looked at me earlier, the way his voice had dropped when he said my name, that stayed with me. It wasn't just a casual moment. It had felt loaded with possibility, dangerous, in a way I hadn't expected. And the worst part was, a small part of me liked it. After dinner, Dan suggested we all head into the living room to watch a game. I could feel myself tightening up, not sure if I wanted to be in the same room as Mike, especially with Dan there, completely unaware of the strange tension building. But I didn't want to make things awkward, so I went along with it. We sat on the couch, Dan on one end, me in the middle, and Mike on the other side. At first I thought it would be fine. The TV was loud, Dan was focused on the game, and for a little while it felt like maybe I'd been imagining things earlier. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mike shifted closer to me. Not enough for Dan to notice, but enough for me to feel it. The heat of his body next to mine, the way his knee brushed against mine when he moved, it sent a pulse of awareness through me, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I tried to focus on the game, but I couldn't. Every small movement Mike made seemed amplified in my mind. The brush of his leg against mine, the way his arm rested a little too close to my shoulder. It was driving me crazy, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend that nothing was happening. I glanced over at him, trying to gauge if he was doing this on purpose, and the look he gave me in return was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly, and it wasn't casual. It was full of a quiet hunger, the kind that made my stomach flip and my heart pound in a way it hadn't in years. For a moment, I panicked. What if Dan noticed? What if he could feel the tension between us? But when I looked at him, he was absorbed in the game, oblivious to everything that was happening right beside him. I should have been relieved, but instead, it only made the tension worse. I was trapped between them, my husband on one side, my husband's best friend on the other, and all I could think about was how wrong this was, and yet how much I didn't want it to stop. The minutes stretched on, feeling longer and heavier with each passing second. Mike's subtle movements were impossible to ignore now. The way his leg stayed pressed against mine just a little too long, the occasional glance he shot my way filled with something unsaid. I could feel the tension building between us, growing stronger, and with Dan sitting just a few feet away, completely unaware, the whole situation felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. I told myself that I needed to get up, to make an excuse and leave the room, but I was frozen. Part of me didn't want to go. I hated how I felt about it, how my body was betraying me with its response to Mike's closeness, to the idea that someone was looking at me in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. Mike's hand rested casually on his knee, so close to mine that I could feel the warmth of his skin. I stared at it, willing myself not to move. But when his fingers twitched, brushing lightly against my leg, a jolt of electricity shot through me. It was barely a touch, just the briefest graze of his skin against mine, but it was enough to send my heart racing. My breath hitched, and I glanced at Dan, still oblivious, lost in the game, laughing at something on the screen. I shifted slightly, trying to put some space between us without being too obvious. But Mike didn't back off. His hand moved again, just enough for our fingers to touch, and this time he didn't pull away. Neither did I. It was wrong, and I knew it. I could hear the voice in the back of my head screaming at me to stop, to get up, to do something, anything to put an end to this before it went too far. But I didn't, and I hated myself for it. "Karen," Mike whispered, so softly that Dan couldn't hear. His voice was low, and when I turned to look at him, there was something in his eyes that made my pulse quicken even more. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was serious, intense, and I could feel the pull between us like a magnet, drawing us closer. I didn't respond, couldn't trust myself to speak. I just stared at him, my mind racing, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. And then, just as I felt the weight of the moment tipping into something I couldn't take back, Mike shifted away. He cleared his throat, sitting up straight, and just like that, the spell was broken. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my chest tight with relief and something else, something like regret. Dan, still completely unaware, looked over at us and smiled. "You two all right? You've been awfully quiet." I forced a laugh, trying to act as if nothing had happened. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, my voice sounding more casual than I felt. Just tired, I guess." Mike didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the TV. But I could still feel the weight of everything that had passed between us, hanging in the air, unfinished, unresolved. I knew that nothing had actually happened. Not really, but it felt like we'd come so close to something neither of us could afford to let happen. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept my distance from Mike, barely making eye contact, and as soon as the game was over, I excused myself and went upstairs to bed. I could hear Dan and Mike talking downstairs, laughing like everything was normal, but I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. When Dan came to bed later, he wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. I loved him. There was no question about that. But whatever had almost happened with Mike tonight had shaken me, made me question things I hadn't questioned in years. As I lay there in the dark, Dan's steady breathing beside me, I wondered what would happen the next time I saw Mike. Would we pretend like nothing had changed? Could we go back to being the way we were before, or had something shifted between us forever? I didn't know the answer, but as I closed my eyes, I promised myself that I wouldn't let it go any further. Whatever had almost happened tonight, it would stay in the past. It had to.